London was, but is no more. Just imagine for a second having to write those exact words in your diary. It's September 1666. You're standing in a field miles away from your home, and you're looking up, and the sky above you is literally glowing like the inside of a burning oven. The air is just incredibly hot, and it's so thick with this black, suffocating smoke that you can barely even breathe. You are John Evelyn, a 17th century writer, and you are watching your absolute beloved city, the great, sprawling metropolis of London, being completely erased from the map by a monstrous, roaring inferno.
Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most defining moments in urban history, the Great Fire of London. But, this isn't just a story about destruction and ashes. It's actually this incredible narrative of architectural rebirth, resilience, and the sheer human will to bounce back. We're going to trace this massive event from its super small origins in a tiny bakery, through the terrifying devastation of the city, all the way to the visionary plans that birthed a triumphant new skyline.
Okay, let's dive straight into Section 1, the spark in Pudding Lane.
To really grasp the macro-scale destruction of London, we first have to zoom all the way into a single, localized micro-narrative. Because actually, this disaster didn't start with a massive explosion or an invading army. It started in the quiet, early hours of a Sunday morning, right in the home and shop of a king's baker named Thomas Farner on this narrow, tightly packed street called Pudding Lane. And thanks to some newly uncovered research, we can now reconstruct the exact timeline of that terrifying night. So at 1 a.m. on September 2nd, the ovens were supposedly put out. But by 2 a.m., a journeyman baker named Thomas Dagger, who had literally just moved from Wiltshire to work for Farner, woke up violently choking on thick smoke. The house was an absolute inferno. Dagger quickly alerts the family, and by 2:15 a.m., they realize the stairs are completely impassable. So Dagger, Farner, and Farner's son and daughter are forced to scramble out of an upper-story window and climb along the rooftops just to save their lives. But tragically, by 2:30 a.m., an unnamed maid in the house, who was either too terrified to climb out the window or was simply trapped, became the very first victim of the Great Fire.
From that single, tiny oven, the flames breached the bakery's walls. Driven by the draft of these narrow alleys, the fire moves rapidly down Pudding Lane, carrying right on down Fish Street Hill. It quickly swallows the nearby Star Inn, completely engulfs the local church of St. Margaret's, and suddenly, it's no longer a house fire, right? It's a neighborhood fire, and its deadly march is heading directly toward the River Thames.
Moving on to Section 2, an unstoppable inferno.
So the crucial point is, how exactly does a neighborhood fire become a city-ending apocalypse? To understand that, we've got to shift our focus to the macro scale of the disaster and look at why London's infrastructure failed so spectacularly. Because 17th century London was essentially a giant tinderbox just waiting for a spark, combined with this perfect storm of environmental factors. First off, the buildings were almost entirely made of timber and heavily coated in pitch. The streets were notoriously tightly packed. The upper floors projected so far out they almost touched the houses across the street, which allowed flames to literally leap from roof to roof. Then, you've got a fierce eastern wind driving the flames forward. When the fire hit the river, it reached these warehouses packed with highly combustible goods, stuff like oil and tallow. And to make matters even worse, a previous fire in 1633 had destroyed a vital water wheel on the Thames. This meant there was absolutely no water pressure in the wooden trunk mains to fight the blaze. Human help was pretty much completely useless at this point.
Just look at the terrifying scale of the flames over the Thames on this slide. The fire hit those river warehouses and just erupted into a towering inferno. It burned so intensely that it actually created its own microclimate. Our diary writer John Evelyn noted that the heat was so profound it felt like it ignited the very air itself. The light from the flames could be seen 40 miles away for days, and the smoke cloud stretched for nearly 50 miles. People were in such a state of sheer shock and consternation that many didn't even try to save their belongings at first. They just ran, crying out in total lamentation.
Which brings us to Section 3. London is no more.
So after days of this unstoppable burning, the wind finally dies down, and they take the drastic measure of blowing up houses with gunpowder to create gaps wide enough to halt the flames. And as the smoke clears, the horrific aftermath is finally revealed. And the raw data here is just staggering. 13,200. That is the number of houses reduced to absolute ashes. The pre-1666 street pattern was somewhat there, but the urban fabric, totally annihilated. This massive destruction left roughly 65,000 citizens entirely homeless.
We're talking hundreds of thousands of people, from all ranks of society dispersed into the surrounding fields, sheltering in miserable little huts or tents without a single rag or utensil to their name, completely destitute. But it wasn't just private homes that were lost. 87. That's the number of parish churches wiped right off the map. Centuries of early piety, gorgeous architecture, the grand royal exchange, the beautifully wrought Mercer's Chapel, and the massive halls of the city's trade companies, all of it turned to dust. The entire cultural and civic heart of London simply ceased to exist.
And perhaps most heartbreaking of all, one single cathedral destroyed. This was the venerated Old St. Paul's, the absolute crown jewel of the city. As the fire enveloped this massive structure, the heat was so incredibly intense that the cathedral's roof, which by the way was made of no less than 6 acres of solid lead, completely melted. Eyewitnesses actually reported seeing the liquid lead literally flowing in a stream down the glowing red fiery pavements of the streets below. Unbelievable.
Now what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer scale of the ruin left behind. Evelyn described how immense blocks of massive Portland stone were calcined, basically popping and flying off the building like grenades. The vaults collapsed, breaking all the way down into St. Faith's below, entirely consuming the massive magazines of books they had stored down there for safety. It was left as this sad skeletal ruin of what used to be one of the most beautiful porticos in all of Europe.
And finally, Section 4. I will rise again.
So out of this utter desolation, we see this miraculous pivot from tragedy to triumph. Before the ashes had even fully cooled, King Charles II mandated that the city had to be rebuilt, and it had to be rebuilt better. To lead this monumental rescue mission, he turns to some brilliant minds, most notably the visionary architect Sir Christopher Wren. Wren is tasked with redesigning the city and, crucially, giving London a brand new cathedral. And there's this deeply emotional, almost poetic anecdote about how Wren found his inspiration for it. One day, while meeting his team right there on the devastated site, Wren asks a workman to bring him a piece of stone from the rubble so they can mark the exact center point for the new cathedral's dome. The workman brings over a broken piece of an old gravestone. They place it on the ground, wipe away the ash and dust, and realize there is a single Latin word carved right into it, resurgam, which translates to, I will rise again. And that single word sparked Wren's ultimate inspiration. He didn't just want to build a structure. He wanted to build a lasting symbol of hope. The word resurgam reminded Wren of the ancient mythical story of the phoenix, a bird that dies in a burning nest only to be born again from the very flames that consumed it. To encourage the resilient Londoners who were out there working so incredibly hard to clear the debris, he commissioned a gifted stonemason to carve this beautiful, majestic phoenix right into the stone of the new cathedral, directly above that word resurgam, a fearless bird rising from the flames, perfectly telling the story of London itself. And this brilliantly illustrates that transformation. Wren's masterpiece stands in staggering contrast to the tragic, calcined ruins of the old Gothic cathedral. Instead of a traditional roof, Wren designed a soaring, magnificent dome, a feature that had literally never been seen in England before. For Wren, the circular shape of the dome wasn't just an architectural choice, It represented the never-ending, encircling love of God. It reached up to the sky for the entire city to see, offering a community space of peace and a rock-solid promise that the city could and would rise to new life from the ashes of disaster.
That new St. Paul's Cathedral still stands today, over 350 years later, right in the heart of the city that was rebuilt by those amazingly resilient Londoners. And honestly, looking at it forces us to reflect on our own times of hardship and disaster. Because resilience isn't just about surviving the fire, it's about what we choose to build in the aftermath. Which leaves us with a pretty powerful thought to ponder. When we face our own collective trials, what physical and cultural structures will we build today that will inspire hope and resilience 350 years from now? Thank you so much for exploring with us, and we'll see you in the next Explainer.